Hey, how you doing today? This is Mark Travis with Mark Travis & Company. I wanted to talk a little bit about strategy today. So, how's your strategy process working out for you today? It's kind of scary out there. The world changes faster and faster every day. So let's talk a little bit about traditional strategy first before I go into a new framework I've found that is really good. Basically, strategy has always been thought of as strategy execution in a nutshell. What's your vision statement? What are your organizational values, your focus areas, strategic objectives? These are things that usually take 6 weeks to formulate a 5-year strategy. I don't know anybody who can really feel comfortable setting a 5-year strategy these days. Even the data, I've got an article over here from 2016, and it states that basically no one can really predict the future anymore. CEOs have been, relying on data to predict the future. It hasn't really worked out. Scott Wine, who was CEO of Polaris, he said several times they tried to rely on the predictive data that they had bought at great cost, actually. And they finally said, we just have to depend on our employees and our remote employees in countries to figure out, what we're going to do. I mean, Polaris has a pretty big hand in all kinds of equipment, snowmobiles and engines and things of that nature. So they're going to more of a real-time model. What do you need these days? I mean, you need speed, you need flexibility. And by the way, sometimes you put stuff in place to give you speed, which takes away your ability to be flexible. I've seen plenty of IT systems go in and technologies go in that lock in a process to make it more efficient and faster. And all that does is decrease the speed to be able to move someplace else. Innovation. You've got to be able to see that innovation coming up. Risk assessment. How many of you have good risk assessment plans? I mean, I'm sure in the past month, a lot of you have come up with good risk alternative plans, mitigation plans. But have you been regularly doing that? What are you going to do going forward? The volatility, even with our current environment, volatility has been increasing by leaps and bounds over the past few years. You can't do strategy in 5-year increments anymore. So I like Sentient Strategy, which is something that Alan Weiss came up with. Alan is one of my mentors. He's written, 18 books. Co-wrote one with Marshall Goldsmith, if you know him. Made millions of dollars consulting with heads of companies over the decades. He's licensed Sentient Strategy to a few of us consultants. I think there's now probably 15 consultants who are licensed to do this worldwide. And it's basically designed to give you that real-time feel for what your environment is and how you react to it. It's kind of funny. I think of the strategy that most people come up with is internally focused. I mean, vision statement, organizational values, focus areas, strategic objectives. What should this product do, and what should it look like in 2 years? Who knows what the environment's going to look like in 2 years? It's like that. What was that movie? Basically, one of the ship's captain is going. The submarines are going so fast they could run over my daughter's stereo system and not even realize it. That's why most companies work on the long-term strategy. So short-term, you want to build 2 skills. Awareness of your environment and your consciousness of your actions once you're in that environment. So awareness, awareness of your internal customers, how they interact with each other, your customers, external, your competitors, your supply chain, new technologies that are, coming along that can sprout up at any minute. Those are examples of, awareness of your environment. Consciousness is, are you aware of the actions available to you in that environment at any given time? When you make actions, when you create actions and roll them out, are you aware beforehand of what those actions are going to result in? I really like this type of thinking because you build a culture using these 2 axes to fine-tune and align yourself with your customer base. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters, is your customer base. Can you give them the value that they need, that they will pay you for? That's it. And you need that to be in real time these days because life's moving too fast. So let's talk about some companies in the same, quadrant that we were talking about earlier. Let me give you an example of some, a group of people that have very high awareness, very conscious of their actions. EMTs, emergency medical technicians. They are very aware, the second they get the alarm that, something's going on, they're talking to each other, they know what's going on. When they arrive, they, gather more information, they get feedback from everybody about what's going on. They look at the data coming out of the patient. They know what actions, they know if they do a splint or they do, certain types of actions, that there's legal implications potentially. And sometimes they say, screw it, I've got to save the patient's life, so they go ahead and do it anyway, which is good. But they know, like when they put them in, the ambulance, they get them to the hospital. These people are very aware. Don't get paid near enough for what they do. So along those lines, that's an example of, a group that's very, very in tune. That's the way your company needs to aspire to. I love Sony camera as an example of someone who's also in tune. I'm actually filming this on a Sony camera. I mean, it's just amazing how far Sony has come. They basically took Nikon and Canon by surprise and have completely wiped out their revenues. And the way they do that is they are aware of what customers wanted. They wanted smaller cameras, for one. They wanted to be able to do things with their photography equipment that just weren't available at the time. Or were too expensive. They monitor religiously the forums on places like DP Review or Sony Rumors, and they look at what the photographers say about the equipment that's coming out, and it's almost, you can see it. The photographers are like, oh, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. Next thing you know, they come out with a camera that has that built into it, or a lens that has that built into it, or something along those lines. Canon finally just came, and Nikon, they finally have just come out with mirrorless cameras. It's like, 3 years later? And they still have their weak points against Sony. Sony's still the clear leader. So they're very aware, very conscious of their actions. I'm a pilot, and another good example I like to use are 3 different manufacturers in the aviation industry that supply avionics. Let me just start with, I'll start with a high awareness, high consciousness. Garmin has taken over the market. If you look at their 10K and their financials, their avionics unit has consistently grown every single year for the past 10 years, by good amounts every year. And the way they do that is they come out with great products that pilots want. They serve the home-built industry, which isn't as regulated, so they get feedback from that industry, and they're aware of what pilots really want. What information do they want in front of them when they're going through a process to file an IFR flight plan to get from, say, Atlanta to Birmingham. What's the process of when they plug something in? How can they make that easy? They're very aware, they're very conscious of their actions, and they also read the aviation forums. As a matter of fact, they've got 3 or 4 representatives that go out and monitor and answer questions. I'll see a thread pop up and someone's just really pissed off at what Garmin did, for some reason, either in, making something or one of the companies that implement for them. So there's avionics companies that install these avionics. It's not Garmin, it's other third parties. But they'll complain about that. And if it falls back on Garmin, the Garmin reps, they're always out there saying, hey, we recognize this problem, or, call me at this phone number. They're in a real-time communication with their audience. So Garmin's done great. Avidyne, I like Avidyne a lot. They're another company that competes with Garmin. And, they're also very aware and they participate, but their consciousness of their actions sometimes isn't as good as Garmin. They tried to have a warranty clause in their equipment recently that you'd basically extend your warranty from, say, 2 years to 5 years by signing a clause that you wouldn't sue them if you were in an accident, something like that. Or you would release them from liability. The pilot community went ape over that. They're like, well, what if I crashed because your avionics told me to do something and it drove me into the ground? It was a good idea because they're trying to get around all the litigation and expense that they have to put aside for lawsuits. There are some stupid laws and things out there, but they're also there to protect us. There's good laws on the books. But it adds an expense that's just amazing to the aviation industry. I mean, like an airplane may cost $50,000 in materials. there's another 200,000 in liability that you have to set aside. So I can understand why they did it, but that's not very conscious of their actions. They actually lost quite a few sales to Garmin during that transition period. But their avionics are superior. I mean, you enter in a flight plan, you can do it with much less button pressing. It's much more intuitive. In my mind, I'm an Apple guy, so it's kind of like Apple versus Microsoft. At Apple, it just works. Actually, I say that, lately that hasn't quite been the case, right? They're getting kind of too complicated, but still easier. Bendix King, that's another company that they've just lost their way. They're about as bad as, Sears and Kmart. They're not aware, they're not conscious. They basically white labeled Avionics equipment. They just took the faceplate off and put their faceplate on. So everyone's looking at it going like, okay, well, why would I buy that when for the same price or a little bit less I can get the Avionics equipment? They claim they have a better worldwide network of avionics technicians in their network of companies that they work with. But if you look at any of the forums, all these avionics tech people say that they've hated Bendix King for the past 10 years because they haven't supported all their old equipment. You can't get past that. These are the guys that you get to install the equipment. And, where are they going to go with that? They're not going to go anywhere with that. Basically, they've had one piece of gear that they had developed offshore that it was a great navigator. I mean, it probably would give Avionics and Garmin a run for their money. But their whole network of installers couldn't stand to work with them. So there you go. Sears, Kmart, they're in the same. They're not aware. They're not conscious. They've just kind of gone by the wayside. They've had plenty of opportunity to be aware and conscious of where the market is going. They've kind of been like, 2 years late, and which is way behind the curve. How about very conscious of their actions and execution, but not very aware of their environment, like what could happen in their environment. Supply chain businesses. Right now, the supply chain is reconfiguring on a real-time basis. People don't know where to source from right now. It's also affecting supply chain finance companies. It's really risky. There's a lot of hidden liability embedded in that because, if you're covering up that finance between, the manufacturer and the retailer, when is that going to come out? But somebody has to be in the middle of all that because those are good, existing, valuable businesses. Airlines, they're definitely in that bucket. They're very conscious of, when they do things, the effect it's going to have on their people. But right now, their awareness of how everything is coming together has really caught them off guard. That's also gotten the hospitality industry caught off guard. Nobody in the hospitality industry, Hertz just declared bankruptcy. They weren't prepared. They weren't coming up with good contingency plans. What would happen if? Customer service in Hertz has actually been going downhill for a couple of years anyway. I had Enterprise wasn't working at the airport I used to frequent, last Christmas, and I had to use Hertz. It was a pain. I wasn't impressed at all. So, the fact that they're declaring bankruptcy now, they've just not been aware of their market or conscious. They've just been running straight on their own. Business as usual, it's working okay. We'll just keep going this way. Well, look what happened now. So how do you take this and implement it into Sentient Strategy? You basically say, where am I on this awareness versus consciousness chart? And let me challenge you. If your senior executive team was with you in the room, would they agree with you? Are you just a little bit over on one of the quadrants? Maybe you're aware, but you're not conscious. You're not really collecting information back from your employees or your customers on a real-time basis. You've kind of got, you've got this focus on what you need to do in 6 months, a year. That's what you think. Are you really tying that back into a real-time feedback loop? What's the cause of that? So there's 14 strategic factors that we look at, and I'll just name a couple of them. Who are your ideal customers? Most people, they gather customers and they never really look at them. They just keep looking at acquiring more customers. I've got another set of tools that one of my fellow consultants came up with called the 80-20 rule. And if you really look into your books and you can find customers that you've had on the books that you've gone in a different direction, but you keep serving those customers. They're costing you 50% of your overhead. It's probably only like 4 to 10% of your customer base, but they're costing you 50% of your overhead. you need to shed those customers, give them to competitors, find some third party to take them over and continue to service them. You don't want to look bad. But I mean, there's all kind of ways you can do that. Product pricing came to mind just now. Basically, you need to figure out what customers are willing to pay and then design a product to fit that. Most people don't think about that. They build a product they think is great and they keep adding features, and by the time you look at it, it costs almost as much to build it as you get in revenue. But that's could be part of your process that you need to change. Branding, marketing. Just because you find information in the field, you've got that real-time feedback, how aware are your customers of what you're doing to meet them? The hockey puck's always moving. You got to skate to it. So is your brand, is your marketing keeping up? Geographies. Kim Lamnick of Insight Enterprises has taken more of a strategy where he can move things around and deal in more of a real-time environment. Same with Delphi. After the last recession, he closed a lot of the plants, but when they started ramping back up, he got to where he could move the equipment from one location to another as different manufacturers ramped up to meet demand. So that was a very real-time type of operation that he set up that's worked really well. People and culture. Strategy is basically a framework that you use to keep people, give them a guide to make decisions with. Steer your culture in the right direction. The better your culture is, the better you can push these decisions down and not have to make decisions up top. Now what you want to do is, once you determine what these strategic factors are that'll get you from wherever you are on the grid to the upper right, awareness and consciousness, pick the top 3. You don't need 5, 6, 4, whatever. Pick the top 3. That's what you can focus on. This is a very inexpensive strategy. You don't spend weeks in hiring people and buying data. And this is a real time. Your top management team is in the room. We go through on whiteboards, and I can do this virtually as well. It's no problem. But you go through and you write this stuff down and pick and put it through a litmus test. If you've got 5 factors, we have a litmus test scoring system that determines where those rank. And you pick the top 3 and then come back in 6 months if you need to, pick another 3. You can get these things in process in a week. I mean, if all executives are in the room, you decide what the factors are, they know what they are, they can go back to their teams and start implementing it immediately. It's not like you set a strategy with a group of people and then you've got to have another event where you bring people in and explain to them what the strategy is, and then they've got to go out and figure out, like, okay, how do I tell my teams, this, I didn't see this coming, and it's a real time, everybody's involved. That's about it. I mean, please call me. I'd love to discuss it with you more. It's a brilliant way to think about strategy, and I don't know why more companies aren't doing it. Look in the comment section below, give me a call, send me an email, and thanks for your time.